bit about our cool alumni here. So Jessica Phillips is an English language arts teacher at the Elmwood Village Charter School, where she has been teaching and learning with students since 2020. Since then, she has worked with students to bring a newspaper club and GSA club to the school and co-founded its National Junior Honor Society chapter. Jessica earned her graduate degree in Urban English Education in 2023 and continues to work with teachers across Western New York to integrate anti-racist and social justice pedagogy into their practices. Through the Anti-Racist Inquiry Collective, Jessica planned lessons and resources to support Western New York's teachers and students after the Tops Massacre in 2022. She spoke on critical whiteness and anti-racist education at Winnie Nett's Fall 2022 conference, and most recently, she has worked with the 1619 Teacher Institute. This institute, Jessica worked to create unit plans for middle school students utilizing the 1619 project and designed units on Afrofuturism and power, privilege, and oppression. Anti-racist and culturally relevant teaching practices are central to what Jessica does in and outside of the classroom, allowing for meaningful and authentic learning experiences for students and teachers across Western New York.
I'm so nervous. This is a very full circle moment for 2017 me. So I'll find my footing within the first couple parts of this. But I'm really happy, I'm really excited to be here. My hope with this talk is that you're gonna walk away with some practical things that you can do and implement in your classroom, and that it's not just going to be super theory heavy all the time. That's part of it because we need to ground ourselves in that, but what can you actually do about everything? So some background, we went over that already, but I do teach 8th grade at Elmwood Village Charter School. These are some of my students from last year. These school mascot pounds. At EVCS, I don't have a choice in the canon text that I teach, but I do have a choice in the resources that I can bring in. I can bring in as many paired texts as I want to. I can bring in as many outside resources as I want to, but the school canon I have to stick to. So that's a for better or for worse situation. So I'll talk about how I've worked through my school canon a little bit to incorporate some resources from the 1619 project, to incorporate resources from elsewhere, and give my students a framework that I believe and I hope will make them successful when they go to high school. As you know, I got my master's in urban education in 2023, which sort of uniquely positions me to be talking about anti-racist teaching. It specifically trained me to have these types of conversations with my students, but it's also something that I have been interested in for a long time and that I knew I wanted to bring to the classroom. So having that background in urban education does uniquely position me to be able to talk about how to bring race, gender, disability, social construct, and lenses into the classroom. So some objectives for today are going to see a lot of student work on these slides, and it's going to be wordy, but we'll talk through it. We're going to understand how I could use the 1619 project in Afrofuturism to transform student thinking, to make them think outside of the box, but also push them towards a better future, because the present is a little grim, which I will be we'll get into shortly. We'll explore real-world strategies for anti-racist teaching and anti-bias teaching as well, and connect theory to the lived experience of students in your classroom and also yourself, because within the classroom, it's not just students, you are there as well. And I fully believe that the personal is political, so your presence in the classroom has weight and value. Okay. A lot's happening right now. We live in a time of urgency where I'm not sure what you guys have been talking about in your classes, but it's hard to be a teacher right now. There's a lot in the media, there's a lot of pushback, there's a lot of do this, don't do that, or you'll be fired, or you'll lose your job, or these questions that can make us feel so insecure in our profession and so insecure in our current moment. Across the country, educators are facing legislation that bans books, restricts curriculum, threatens teachers for teaching an honest history or just affirming student identities. History as we know it is sort of being sanitized in the name of being neutral. But as we know, neutrality only benefits the status quo. It only benefits the people who are in power. So some examples. In Florida, teachers are required to teach that slavery brought personal benefit to enslaved people, which is a wildly inaccurate and harmful claim. In Texas, a teacher was placed on leave for having a Black Lives Matter poster in their classroom. In Tennessee, teachers were told to avoid material that might make students feel uncomfortable about race or gender, effectively just like silencing conversations about queer students and systemic racism and change. We have to name these tensions. We have to talk about them because they're real, whether we want them to be or not. But we have to also go beyond talking about them. We can't stop there. The classroom is truly a democratic space, and it deserves to be protected. Students deserve to know the truth about things. Students deserve to have their voices centered. We can choose to ask hard questions. We can choose to give students opportunity to grapple with the complexity of all of this, because they're seeing it too. They're seeing it too. They're seeing this polarization. They're coming to school, and they desperately need a safe place to talk about this. Because imagine being 13 and seeing that Black Lives Matter mural is being destroyed in Washington, D.C. And then coming to school, and your teacher's either going to talk about that with you or they're not, and whatever choice that teacher makes holds some value and weight, right? It's going to have an impact no matter what you choose to do as the educator in the room. When students and teachers, what I've found is that students and teachers are like so willing to talk about these things. They're willing to discuss them with students, but like I've said before, we need to examine the ways that we're implicated. Like, what does this actually mean? It's one thing to say, yes, this is happening, and it's really disturbing. And it's another thing to say, yes, this is happening and it's really disturbing, so what can we do in our local community, in our classroom, in our conversations to create change towards a better and more imaginative future? So some examples of student work I've had them do in the past. At the start of the year, we do Banned Books Week, which has gotten like progressively more into a longer unit every single year since I've been teaching about banned books. We talk about like many different topics in my classroom. We talk about race, gender, disability, queer topics. I want all students to feel like they have a voice and choice in my classroom material. That being said, part of all of this that's going on is there's some like watchdog behavior in classrooms. There are some like political groups, parent groups, Moms for Liberty is like super involved in Western New York. That like to sort of have a say about what goes on in their classrooms. Something that I really always try to remember is that parents care about their kids. They care about their kids. Whether or not we agree with how they go about it, they care about their kids. So one of the strategies that I'll provide for you later is when you're in a disagreement with a parent, and when that care from that parent looks like maybe trying to get a text removed from your classroom, how to speak from a place of like love and intention and care for that student, because that's going to reach a parent, that's going to reach an administrator more than being argumentative well. We have to back ourselves up with facts and research and care and intention in order to keep moving forward and keep sort of like filling our cup back up. Because it's a long fight we have ahead of us, okay? All right. One last thing to think about as well is who does your silence benefit. So if you're in the classroom, if you are planning a unit and you're not talking about certain things, ask yourself why. Like, why are you avoiding that conversation? If your student asks you a question that you feel uncomfortable with, it's okay to feel uncomfortable with a question. You don't have to know the answer to everything, but you do have a duty to tell students the truth. They deserve to know, in my opinion. So have a little turn and talk to break up the chatter, but I'm wondering if you guys can talk to each other or write it down or just think about something that you learned in school that you later realized was incomplete, biased, or just not true. And how did that shape you? So I'll set a timer for a quick minute.
Are we doing a think, pair, share? You want them to talk to each other?
Yeah, you can turn and talk, you can write it down, you can think about it. Thank you. Okay. I got to hear a couple tidbits of conversations, but a lot of people seem to remember that they were taught something that was incomplete, biased, or not true. So how do we address that as educators? How do we change that so that our future students aren't having that same conversation that you just had about us? Okay. So getting into the 1619 project, I'm going to have some QR codes, so like you're free to just pull your phone out and scan it if you want some resources. But to get into the 1619 project, people often think that like that's for college, that's for high school, but middle schoolers are capable of way more than people think they are. In my classroom, I use excerpts, so I use poetry, personal essays, I use podcast clips, artwork from the 1619 project in the New York Times Magazine version, which that's what's linked for you. And I scaffold it heavily. It is my firm belief that there is nothing that cannot be done with a specific age group as long as you scaffold it appropriately. I'll get into some examples about how I did that as well. But the payoff that I've seen from using the 1619 project in my classroom is that students feel seen, they feel engaged, they're asking questions that matter, they're asking questions that are deeper. So, I have, I'll get into like the short stories that I've done and how I just start having conversations about race with my students. But I've used a couple of short stories and I paired nonfiction text from the 1619 project to explore Afrofuturism. The book is great if you can get your hands on it. The magazine, also great. It's like 100 pages long, so I'm sorry if I'm bogging your phones down. But this is where I got a lot of my material from my students. Because if you think through like middle schooler eyes, you're gonna want to read a magazine over like a 100-page book, right? The biggest reason I wanted to join the 1619 Teacher Institute and also incorporate this work in my classroom is because it introduces positionality into my classroom, which I feel is really important for students of any age, to start asking who wrote this, why was it written, who was it written for, who benefits from these stories that are currently being told to us. Okay, so some foundations for critical conversations. I do this at the very beginning of my year. And we start with this chart. I have a bubble sheet and I ask students why might people feel XYZ way when having conversations about race. And they work in groups of like 4 or 5 and discuss why would somebody feel angry, hopeful, sad, confused or surprised, defensive or ashamed when having conversations about race. You can see the responses that my students came up with. And again, these are 8th graders. So people might feel defensive or ashamed because they feel hatred or they've experienced trauma. They might feel ashamed that other human beings act like that. People might feel confused or surprised because of the past and how Black and brown people were treated, or like, why me? Like, what did I do to deserve this sort of treatment? We start with empathy, okay? We start with students exploring why would somebody feel a difficult emotion when we're having a class conversation about race. Then we move forward into talking about what to do with all of those feelings. Because you're 13, you got like a lot of hormones going on in your body. And so it can be a little bit unpredictable and chaotic at times. So what do we do with all of that? This is a Courageous Conversations Compass. It's from the 1619 project, but it's also been like widely used in anti-racist teaching spaces. And the goal is to be centered. But many people often find themselves in one of the 4 quadrants. You can tend to feel things, excuse me, you can tend to feel like your beliefs are challenged. So you have a sense of right or wrong, and this can end up with people having their feelings hurt. Some people think about race really logically. They think with their head, so they're just like data and fact-based. Others act with their body. I see this a lot with middle schoolers. When they're uncomfortable, that leg is going to be bouncing, they're going to be fidgeting, they're going to be feeling like they want to leave the room and go get a drink of water if they're feeling a little bit like stressed or triggered from something. There's also like feeling in your heart. So where do you sort of align with this? Like, what emotions do you feel when having conversations about race? Like I said, the goal is for students and teachers to be centered, but that's like in a perfect world, and classrooms are unpredictable spaces. So some things to think about is what skills do students need to have before even having conversations about race. They need to know where the bright lines are. They need to know where the boundaries are. And that needs to be teacher modeled. So for example, I teach Warriors Don't Cry. It's a nonfiction text about by one of the Little Rock Nine. And the N-word is all over the book. Like constantly, multiple times, every page. And we read that book aloud, but I tell my students, I'm not going to say it, you're not going to say it, but we're not going to replace it with anything. And we get into why we make that decision, why we're not replacing it, why we're not saying it. But like the word holds value, it holds weight, it holds context. We're not going to erase this from our narrative. But I have to model that for my students. I can't just start reading Warriors Don't Cry. And for me, I was that student that would always like skip down the page a little bit, and if I see that word coming and I don't know if I can trust my teacher, that's a scary moment for a student. So you have to model for your students and just be as proactive as possible about what conversations about race look like in your classroom, especially as a white educator or a white passing educator. You have to be so upfront with your students about where your own positionality lies so that students feel like they can exist in your room. The goal is for them to feel like they can trust you, but students don't owe you trust. We need to have a safe classroom first. Once we move through our Courageous Conversations Compass, and we have that talk about like where do you tend to feel things, what supports do you need, then I have students look at texts from other students. This is from the 1619 project. It's like 4 pages of what students are saying about race and racism in America. This was compiled in the summer of 2020, and it's really good. Scan it, it's really good. Students are talking about how they feel about race from a variety of different perspectives. There's perspectives from various states within the US, there's perspectives from outside of the country, there's more conservative perspectives, there are more inclusive perspectives, and my students read through this with the goal of annotating. They needed to find statements that they agreed with, disagreed with, things that challenged their beliefs. This is right after we have that courageous conversation talk, and this is my students, for many of them, first experience having their beliefs challenged. And it's in a structured way. Because if you're having your beliefs challenged by a stranger on a document, we can talk through and work through that. That's a lot easier to get through and then build those skills before we have a disagreement during our class seminar, during our class discussion, during, when it's your classmate and your peer. I don't know if you can quite make out some of these student annotations, but for me, I'm constantly thinking about who does my curriculum look like and sound like? Does it sound like students belong here? Does it look like my students belong here? Do they see themselves represented? Hearing it from teachers is different than hearing it from kids your own age. Does anyone need a sec to scan, or are we good?
She's a little blurry, but
Okay.
yeah, we're good.
All right. So getting into the Afrofuturism of it all. This is not like day one in September. I've set the scene in my classroom. We've set the expectations in my classroom. So now when we're talking about Afrofuturism, first, if you're not familiar with it, it's a movement in literature, music, art that is about imagining a just and liberated future. It's where Black people are characterized not by being resilient, not by the things that they have had to go through or the things that have been done to them, but by the ability to dream of a future where they are involved, they are included, where they get to create that future. Being able to imagine is a privilege. Being able to dream of your future is a privilege and a benefit that not everybody has. To envision a future where you belong, where you are safe, where your rights aren't being attacked, where you're not seeing the Black Lives Matter mural taken down in Washington, D.C. What does your future look like? It's something that so many students might not have the luxury of being able to think about. So using Afrofuturism as a lens, we focused on 3 key elements in my classroom: liberation, imagination, and speculative futures. We started with going over the tenets of Afrofuturism, and then we got into our first story, which was Rhythm Travel by Amiri Baraka. My students, this was short, it was accessible, it talked about music. So many of my students love Tyler, the Creator. They love MF Doom. We talked about how Tyler's Chromacopia album is an Afrofuturist text because he's creating a world in which he can exist. So they were really excited about that. And there were multiple modes of assessment. This was my first time ever incorporating Afrofuturism in my classroom. So as much as my students were playing around with it, so was I. So I was giving them assessments left and right. They were doing short responses. They were annotating the text. They were doing in-text comprehension questions. We had class discussions because I wanted to make sure that they got the Afrofuturism of it all, that they understood why we were doing what we are doing. I taught this for the first time because I took stock of my science fiction unit that is my curriculum that I have to teach, and every single author was a white man. Boring. Every single author was a white man, and that does not reflect my student body, that does not reflect the school, that does not reflect the current reality of the world that we live in. And there's a difference between, I'm not going to throw shade at authors, but there's a difference between imagining a world on Venus where it never stops raining and imagining a future where Black people are liberated. And I wanted to provide my students with that experience. So Rhythm Travel, if you ever have a chance to read it, is like a really fun story to read. We'll read my student response, but if you want to scan also, we listened to the Sound of Afrofuturism Spotify playlist. My students became familiar with Sun Ra, they became familiar with Janelle Monáe, and they really enjoyed just seeing themselves be a part of a science fiction, very white male-dominated genre. So this is one of my students' short responses that we'll quickly read through. The short story Rhythm Travel does fit into the genre of Afrofuturism. We can see it fits into the sci-fi part of the story because in the story people use music to travel through space and time. I know that because in the text it states, now I added rhythm travel. You can disappear and reappear whenever, and that music played. In the text, this man is telling his friend about his new invention called rhythm travel, which allows you to travel back to the point in time when the music you're listening to was made, which fulfills and proves that this is a sci-fi story. I know the story is Afrofuturistic because it takes music, which is a key part of the African American society and community, and literally gives it magical abilities, which for me just goes to show how powerful we are without even noticing it. We can see that in the text it states, yeah, turned into some Sun Ra and hung out inside gravity. You can see when he says, I turned into some Sun Ra, meaning he turned on some of Sun Ra's music and traveled through space and time and literally hung out inside gravity. Now, there's reason this isn't just some basic piece of text from some random sci-fi story. It's because he said he was listening to Sun Ra, who is an artist who tries to use his music to empower Black people, which goes to prove what I said, we are more powerful than we realize. I had 8th graders in my classroom starting to realize the power that they inherently have because I just felt like trying something new, because I saw a deficit in my curriculum and wanted to provide them with more, something better than what like the bare bones binder textbook curriculum has to offer. We used 1619 resources to talk about the birth of American music, which you will find in the magazine if you scanned that. And the second story we read was The Comet. This one was a lot. This had to be amended for middle schoolers. It's very long. It was written in 1920. There was like the language and the vocabulary, I had to switch up a little bit. I think sometimes as teachers we feel like we can't touch a text, but you absolutely can if it's going to benefit your students in their learning, right? Switching out a couple of vocabulary words so this text was accessible to my students, fine, totally paid off. I did remove like a complete section from the text simply because I wasn't willing to discuss the politic of an interracial sex scene in 1920 America with 8th graders, but they got the value of the story regardless with that scene removed. So this was an early Afrofuturist text, and it was kind of a painful read for my students because it had them asking, why haven't things changed much since 1920? Why are we in 2025 and this story seems like it could have been written yesterday? This is an example of what my students' notes looked like. So I had them answer some comprehension questions in the text, and this student was talking about the two main characters, Julia, a white woman, and Jim, a Black man. Julia waited to treat him like a human until they were alone, and now that her family has returned, she is back and showing racist norms. Her attitude would change because she now has people in her own class who have the same views to survive with. She is resorting to peer pressure in times of crisis, like all of us now. This is my student connecting the fact that post-2020 summer Black Lives Matter movement, white allyship died. Like, where did it go? People stopped doing things. People stopped meeting in community. It sort of like fizzled out. This is my 8th grade student picking up on that and connecting it to a story that was written in 1920. I have another student's example here. They were talking about how Jim is treated as a nobody, seeing as he's a Black man in 1900s America. He's the one that no one cares about, but he's the one that has to work very hard. During the comet strike, everyone is dead except for Julia, who's seen as a hero, at least to Julia, and she sees him as helpful and important and somebody more than who she saw him as before. I know this because on this page it states, yes, I was not human yesterday, he said. So she looked at him. And your people were not my people, she said. But today, she paused. He was a man, no more, but he was in some larger sense a gentleman. Sensitive, kindly, chivalrous. Everything save his hands and his face. Yet yesterday. This shows that before the comet, Jim was really just seen as a Black man who was a different kind from white people and who didn't deserve to be associated with other classes. But during the comet strike, the tables have turned, and since so much of everybody is gone, there's so much less to compare to. Since so many people have died, the differences are less important. That is until Julia realizes there are more people alive than they thought. Since there are still a lot of white people and there are still a lot of Black people, there's an intense shift in the way equality is a necessity versus it being against social norms. When there were less people and pressures to conform, since it was in time of crisis, they had to form an alliance. But now that crisis is mild, instead of choosing to stay together, they decide it's better to stay separate. An 8th grader wrote that. Props to my 8th grade students. They're making text-to-self connections. They're making text-to-world connections. They're learning about the Tulsa Race Massacre. They're using 1619 texts to learn about how Black enslaved people literally built Wall Street in New York City. And reading a story about how a Black man could be the hero, but not for long. And then they're sitting in a classroom in 2025, like that sounds awfully familiar. When I used Afrofuturism in my unit, I wanted to provide students with the opportunity to imagine those better, more liberated futures, but there's still always going to be an element of reality within those Afrofuturist texts. And my students very quickly picked up on that. Our final assessment for our Afrofuturism unit was to write an Afrofuturist story. I wanted to give them a creative outlet, and the assignment directions were very, very lax. 2 pages or less, 2 to 3 paragraph explanation about your story, do an art piece for extra credit, has to be Afrofuturist. So I'll read you a little bit of what, this is one student's text. In the year 2124, New York City was a high-tech metropolis with towering skyscrapers and advanced technology. Despite all the futuristic advancements, the city still held on to memories of the past, particularly the Central Park jogger case from 1989. This case was a graphic reminder of racial injustice that the city couldn't forget. Amara was a bright young scientist with a passion for history. She was well aware of the injustices faced by her ancestors and was determined to make a difference. Amara invented a device called the Memory Weaver, which allowed people to virtually travel back in time and witness historical events as if they were actually there. She believed that by revealing the truth of the past, she could help heal old wounds and promote unity. One day, a group called the Guardians of Justice approached Amara. They wanted her to use the Memory Weaver to revisit the night of the Central Park jogger case and uncover the real events. They hoped that by exposing the truth, they could bring justice to the wrongly accused and highlight the flaws in the justice system. Amara agreed to take on the challenge. She and the Guardians activated the Memory Weaver and was instantly transported to Central Park in 1989. They observed everything leading up to the attack and saw firsthand how the young men were falsely accused. They also noticed the bias and unfair investigation process. The story continues, but this is an Afrofuturist story written by an 8th grader who had an interest because they just watched When They See Us on Netflix and were like, this is awful, how could this happen? While also imagining a better future. And you can see the picture that this student drew of what being that Memory Weaver, what experiencing that time machine was like. This is one more. This is another student's project. I'll let you read through this. But this student was talking about the ancestral connections to the continent of Africa. Talking about like villages, ancestors, with this magical quality that we so often find in Afrofuturist texts, in reimagining a sense of justice that also incorporated elements of beauty, of pain, of ancestry, of resilience. Blink twice and I can go to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to press the button now. But amazing work done by an 8th grade student. This is totally doable in any classroom. If you scaffold things correctly, if you give students the proper tools to be able to have these conversations in class, if you're being thoughtful and intentional about the resources that you bring in, your students can do work like this easily. So I have another little talk question. So much of Afrofuturism is about imagination. But I feel like imagination is not something that's talked about often when we're talking about secondary English classes. In 7 through 12, we tend to get more content heavy, more theory heavy, more testing heavy, but it loses the imagination. So think about what role does imagination play in secondary English classes? What might change if students are invited to imagine a more just future? I'll give you a minute to chit chat.
That's what I'm wondering.
Something I forgot to mention earlier when we're talking about imagination within the classroom is that using the 1619 project provides a defensible curriculum. So if you are worried about doing things like this in your classroom and pushback in any form, the 1619 project is a defensible curriculum. It is standards aligned. So when I did my work with the 1619 project over the summer, I had to have New York State Common Core ELA standards for every single one of these lessons that I showed you. And they tie in. They're there. You can make those connections. But it's defensible. It's something that can stand on its own. It's research backed. And you have the standards to back yourself up as well. You can use those as a tool versus something that like hinders you. So to switch gears, obviously anti-racist teaching is very important to me. It's a core part of who I am as an educator, but as a human. But in theory versus in practice are two different things. In theory, anti-racist educating confronts theories of oppression. It centers marginalized voices, and it prepares students to recognize and challenge these struggles and current events and any sort of like justice-centered beliefs that they feel like their teacher might have or their curriculum might have. When I teach Warriors Don't Cry, it's hard, it's a heavy text, it's a traumatic text to read, but it's important. And my students need that creative outlet, especially the group that I have this year. So I had them do some blackout poetry with some old crusty dusty copies of the text that we had, and we literally ripped the pages out, and they created blackout poetry to reflect their understanding of the text, but also their experience reading it. So my students had to identify a theme, but I also got a gauge of where they were at feeling-wise. So this blackout poem, the teacher, the students were involved. Nobody protected me. And then I had a student do one with the pictures that are in the middle of the book also. Elizabeth Eckford, brave, helpless, vulnerable. This highlighted quote here is one that a student said during the unit. I can somewhat relate to problems in the books that we read, like Warriors Don't Cry. I deal with everyday racism and I get used to it, and you try to fight it, but no matter how hard you try, it's just whatever. I don't see myself in good ways. It would be cool to see myself doing something other than fighting racism. This informs my practice because now I want to try some Afrofuturism. Now I want to try incorporating other more empowering ways for my students to see themselves reflected in the classroom. So, in practice, what anti-racist teaching looks like for me is diverse, critically chosen texts. Every unit, every week, every lesson if possible. It's not a one and done. It's not a yay, we're celebrating Black History Month and then you put it down. It's every single thing that you do. Who is represented in these texts? Whose voice is empowered and disempowered by these texts? Whose stories are being told? Whose stories are not being told? I have students analyze power, privilege, and identity in the literature that we read. And we have regular dialogue, we have regular Socratic circles about justice, equity, and historical truths. As their teacher, I regularly and often acknowledge my privilege, my positionality, and my bias. My lived experience does not reflect the lived experience of a lot of my students. However, I need to maintain high standards for all of my students. When we talk about anti-racist teaching, sometimes people start to feel like, oh, these poor Black students. No. Like, let's empower these Black students. Let's hold them to these high standards and not lessen our standards for them because of whatever white privilege, guilt, saviorism you might personally be feeling. That's why it's so essential to acknowledge your own positionality before you even get into this work. The biggest thing too is giving students an authentic audience. I take my students to Youth Voices every year, and these are 2 variations of projects my students have done. I've had students bring art pieces. I've had students give full-on TED Talks about redlining and segregation in Buffalo. Another student quote, they said that sometimes people brush over topics. Yes, mention the police brutality, and I don't know, sometimes teachers don't go more in depth about it, and it makes us not want to even try talking about those topics anymore. This goes back to what I said at the start of this talk. You can totally mention to your students that things are happening, but then what? Then what? What do you do after you mention it to them? What's the plan of action here instead of just being like, wow, things are really hard? They are hard, but you're the adult in the room. And it is our job as teachers to guide students through that hardness and through the how terrifying some of this reality is. So continuing action, this is not just an extra unit or something that lives outside of the standards. It's deeply connected to everything. It's connected to people's identity, it's connected to literature, history, writing. My students have to be equipped to participate in and also interrogate systems around them. I need my students to know the difference between how to do what they need to do, but also when we can be like, yeah, let's try to fight the system right now. How do we manage that nuance in a classroom full of 13-year-olds? But if students are never encouraged to question things, then the bigger risk is that they just accept things for the way that they are. Then there's apathy. Then they're like, oh, it's just how it is. And you really have to ask yourself, how far are you willing to go? As a teacher, how far are you willing to go to bring truth and power into your classroom? I have a video to show you. This is one of my current students' projects that they will be bringing to Youth Voices this year. And their project is about what do Black girls' futures look like. This is a creative project inspired by an argumentative essay they wrote about the school-to-prison pipeline and how it disproportionately affects Black girls. Remember, I'm talking 8th grade. They did research. They followed and mastered the standards that I needed them to master. But now they're turning this into creative projects.
In 20 years, I hope to see my life being successful, graduating law school, becoming a lawyer, and regretting this.
Considering that Trump's president, I wouldn't see myself getting very far since I'm Black and a girl, because he doesn't like my kind and stuff. So I don't see myself getting far doing the things I want to do when I'm older.
The reality of racism could probably shape my life into being like I'm not reaching my full potential. A lot of people with darker skin complexions will be unsuccessful, even though they are capable of what the other person with a different skin color is.
I feel like I'm gonna have to work 10 times harder as someone else, but I feel like I'll still be successful.
I feel like I'm gonna be on my couch, or I'm either gonna be traveling or doing something.
So as future teachers, this is a lot of information. What do you do with it? Where do you even start? My advice is to start small, but be bold in what you do. Start small with intentional decisions of things that you want to bring in. Start getting to the core of who you are as a teacher. What are your core beliefs? What do you want to bring into the classroom? Things that I've learned is that authentic meaning making, it happens in community. It happens during class discussions. It happens in the hallway. It happens when a student or me says something really awkward or cringy and we laugh about it or we address it and deal with it later. Authentic meaning making does not happen with me sitting at my desk and grading papers. It doesn't happen with me sitting at my desk and planning my lessons. That work is important to the meaning making of it all, but the magic is when you're in the classroom, is when you are with those students. Document your work, have your resources to back you up. I'm happy to help anybody with how to align the standards to an anti-racist curriculum. And don't be afraid to try something new with students. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable. I told my students this is my first time teaching about Afrofuturism, so like bear with me. And they bore with me. We learned a lot together, and it was really cool to be able to explore things at the same time that my students were. The pushback, the fatigue, the fear is hard. It's hard and it's heavy, but if you have a community of other teachers, of other like-minded adults and people around you, it gets a lot easier. I have some of those like-minded adults and teachers in this classroom with me today. So, another little video clip of the student project about the type of future that we're teaching towards. What type of future do you want your classroom to create?
If there was nothing holding me back, I would go to law school and be a lawyer, probably, to defend wrongly accused people.
If racism didn't affect me, I would do like nursing or predominantly white jobs because black people don't get the chances that white people have to do certain jobs because they're black.
To become successful in life and go to college.
I would want to be an actress if racism wasn't a thing.
I would like travel and like go all over the places. My mom says we can't go here because this is happening, or I can't really go here because it's too cold. Like people think really bad things about me because I'm just messing with me. So I would do that.
One more. What is a risk that you are willing to take? What is a risk that you are willing to take to teach more truthfully? And what support do you need to take that risk? Okay. All right, we're almost there. We have arrived at the end. At the heart of this is the question, what future are you teaching towards, right? It's a big question, but you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have the answer to every single question. You can totally Google things with your students. I love it when we do that. But you have to be committed to truth. You have to be committed to equity within your classroom. You have to be willing to care for your students. And I know this quote is already familiar to Dr. Sarcone because I used it for my research project, but it holds true as being like my all-time favorite teaching quote. Teachers should love their students. Revolutionary love is a love that is strong enough to bring out a radical change in our classroom, in individual students, classrooms, school systems, and the larger society that controls them. It looks like the endless dedication, the unyielding belief in the brilliance and potential of every student, and the commitment to stop at nothing to get students to learn. That is my core of my pedagogy. So thank you so much.